we are going to talk about the contemporary issues and some miscellaneous topics, mainly oriented towards gender, tribals, displacement or migration, etc., etc., or social media. Now, in today's class, we are going to start our first topic, that is gender. Gender. That is gender. So in this, I think I left one important concept related to gender, that is related to a study of Leela Dubé, a concept of seed and earth. So before moving towards the contemporary issue, let's discuss the concept of seed and earth. Seed and earth. So Leela Dubé was an Indian anthropologist. And Leela Dubé considered the study of kinship important in the studying gender, as it provides an appropriate context for the understanding of gender in society. So if you have to understand gender in a particular society, so for that purpose, you have to study the kinship system present in that particular society. And because of the importance of sex as one of the important organizing principle of this society, it is important to study the kinship system. So this is how she tried to establish the relationship between condition of women and the kinship system present in particular context of a society or present in a particular society. So in this sense, alliance of gender and kinship is the core of the feminist anthropology presented by Leela Dubé. And she explores kinship system in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And she tried to compare her study or the condition of women in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So she explores kinship system and their impact on the position and the rights of the woman. So through exploring kinship system and the family organizations and their impact on inheritance and resource distribution, female sexuality, bodily processes, living spaces, marriage, nutrition, and education, Leela Dubé brings out in detail condition of women in these particular two regions, that is South Asia and Southeast Asia. And based on these parameters, what were the parameters suggested by her? Inheritance, resource distribution, bodily processes, living spaces, marriage, female sexuality, nutrition, education, access to education. And she concluded her study where she shows that the condition of women based on these parameters shows a better condition in Southeast Asia as compared to South Asia. And further, she write another article named On the Construction of Gender, Hindu Girl in Patrilineal India, on construction of gender, on the construction of gender, Hindu girl in patrilineal India. And in this article, she had given the concept of seed and earth. So in this article, she traces the mechanism through which girls develops a gendered identity by examining the rituals and the ceremonies, language, and practices of family. So how a girl develop a gendered identity? So she begin with the emphasizing, Leela Dubey begins with the emphasizing that the gender differences that are culturally produced are always interpreted as being rooted in biology. And she explained this by using seed and earth analogy. What exactly this seed and earth analogy means? It means men provide the seed, which is the essence, while the woman provide the field, which receive the seed and nourishes it. So men provide the seed and the woman provide the field, which receive the seed and nourishes it. So a child shares the father's blood. And the reason for secondary status given to women comes from the understanding of women as a passive receptacles. Women only receive. And the secondary status of women just because or rely on this cultural belief. And there are two kinds of role generally associated with women. One is pre-marriage and another is in the form of after marriage. In pre-marriage, in her natal group, a woman generally had given two roles, that is, or role of non-functional. Women generally considered to be a non-functional, or women generally considered as transferability. She has to transfer from one family to another family after marriage. And after marriage, the woman role was considered as instrumental. She provides a field for a man to sow his seed for the process of offspring. So this unequal social arrangement is perceived as an arrangement of nature which gives different role to men and women in procreations. And in this manner, girls are generally socialized for their secondary role. So she had given, Leela Dubey given an example, like in a Telugu, bringing up a daughter is like watering a plant in another courtyard. So in this manner, girls are socialized for their secondary role. Or generally it is supposed to be like motherhood is the highest achievement in a woman's life. And marriage is the gateway to motherhood. So everything else is a secondary to these two particular goals. What are these two particular goals? First is motherhood. Second is marriage. And marriage is a gateway to the motherhood. And all these reasons are generally or considered by Leela Dubey as a major cause behind the secondary status for a woman. So this is the concept of seed and earth given by Leela Dubey. Now let's move to the contemporary issues. In this, firstly, we are going to talk about the gender gap report. Gender gap report 2023. And you all know it was brought by World Economic Forum. Now, so according to International Labour Organization, gender gap generally refers to the differences between women and men that are socially constructed and culturally determined. The gender gap refers to the differences between women and men that are socially constructed and culturally determined. And this definition, as you see, emphasizes that the gender gaps are not inherent, but arises from the societal norms and the expectations. And that result generally results in the unequal treatment and opportunities for women and men. So the World Economic Forum, as you all know, an international organization, generally known for its gender gap reports, and it defines the gender gap as the difference between women and men as reflected in social, political, intellectual, cultural, or economic attainments or attitudes. So in this, the World Economic Forum's approach encompasses multiple dimensions and indicators to measure the gender disparity across various spheres of life or social life. So in terms of social and cultural aspect, the gender gap manifests in societal expectation, stereotypes, and the norm generally shape the roles and behavior of men and women. And these expectations often limits or restricts women's access to education, employment opportunity, leadership positions, and we can also say in the form of decision-making processes. So women may face discrimination, biasness, unequal treatment in various areas. Example like healthcare, property right, and legal protection. And the gender gap indices or report annually benchmark the current state and the evolution of gender parity across four key dimensions. As you all know, for your GS purpose, first is economic participation and opportunity. Second is educational attainment. Third is health and survival. Fourth is political empowerment. So the gender gap score in 2023 of all 146 countries included or stand at 68.4%. So at the current rate of progress, it will take 131 years to reach full parity. I'm just stating the facts. And India closed of 64.3% of overall gender gap ranking. And India's ranking is 127 out of 146. So the gender parity score has recovered to pre-pandemic level. So the overall rate of change has slowed down significantly. So gender gap pre-pandemic, now the countries are recovered to pre-pandemic level, but the pace is slowed down. So according to 2023 gender gap indices, no country has yet achieved full gender parity. So Iceland continues to be only the country to have closed more than 90% of its gender gap. Iceland, just remember the name for the mentioning in your answer. Now, gender gap, let's see the gender gap in different sectors. We are going to talk about gender gap in health sector, gender gap in bureaucracy, gender gap, relation between gender gap and or gender and climate change. Let's start. Let's start with gender gap in health sector. Let's start gender gap in health sector. So the difference in the anatomy between various genders implies generally that the diseases and their symptoms may affect different gender differently. So some diseases affect certain genders more than others, like in case of anemia in India, while a few are gender specific conditions. So it is very important to look through a gendered lens for a better understanding of diseases. So according to experts, nearly 1/5 of medications showed a difference in the active dose between men and women. So the women with an early onset of depression are less likely to obtain college degree and less likely to pursue postgraduate degree. And this is the vicious cycle of women's underrepresentation in case of health sector. So the medical field still predominantly follows a male-oriented approach. So disregarding the increasing evidence of physiological differences between men and women beyond reproductive organs, the extensive research highlights the genetic and physiological distinction between men and women, generally in the form of three conditions or three cases. First, like gender bias in treatment, testing, and diagnosis. First, gender bias in treatment, testing, and diagnosis. In this, women have been either overdosing, as in case of, generally as an example of taking sleep medicine. So women faces the challenge of gender gap in testing, diagnosis, and treatments, which arose from a lack of comprehensive research about the conditions dominant among women and biasness towards women in health sector. Second, gender disparity in funding. So gender disparity is also observed in research funding. For example, sex-specific illness such as breast cancer, ovarian syndrome, or pregnancy-related issues, these are serious gap in research. There are serious gap in research that can only be explained by an apathy towards women's only issue. So women in general are more susceptible to mental illness as compared to men. And the similar trend can also be observed among other diseases like depression, Alzheimer's, anxiety disorders, migraine, and headaches. So funding received for research in migraine and anxiety disorder is much lower in proportion to the burden of these illnesses. And third, in case of gender parity in clinical trials. So gender gap was not only observed in terms of funding, but also recorded during clinical trials. Like in India, the pharmacy of the world, as we all to be called as, the gender disparity in clinical trial has even bigger implications. So it has been demonstrated in various studies that women's bodies respond differently to the components of genetic drugs. So the disease burden was higher among women, while their share in clinical trials was not proportionate. And the exclusion of women from clinical trials and research projects addressing sex agnostic critical illness, as an example of it, like cancer and heart diseases. And it resulted in a limited understanding of sex-specific symptoms and responses to treatment. So, our data from World Health Organization 2017, it shows that every day about 808 women die due to complication of pregnancy and childbirth. Almost all of these cases were preventable, but occurred due to interaction between pre-existing medical conditions and pregnancy. And pregnant women are further down the ladder or very less represented in clinical trials and research. So India has several progressive policies with respect to women's health care, including the right to abortion. Now it is time for policy intervention in the space of sex-specific research in medicine and the implementation of outcomes. So this is regarding gender parity in healthcare. Now let's move to the next, on the second, that is glass ceiling effect in Indian bureaucracy. Just write it, glass ceiling effect in Indian bureaucracy. What exactly glass ceiling effect means? Glass ceiling effect refers to invisible barrier and obstacles that hinders the advancement of individuals, particularly women and minorities, to higher position of leadership and power within organization. So it prevents qualified individuals from progressing beyond a certain level in their career, despite their skill, qualification, and aspirations. Now let's see glass ceiling effect in Indian bureaucracy with respect to women. So as you all know, women constitute almost half of the population of the nation. However, their participation in the top decision-making position is not significant. So lack of participation of women in top decision-making process of the government is just because there just were not enough women in Indian administrative services. So recruitment rule were skewed in the favor of men. As an example of it, like earlier, only unmarried women could join the services, and they had to quit if they subsequently married. It was only after the marriage disqualifier was removed that the ratio of women to men in an Indian administrative service went from 1:82 in 1960 to 1:8 in 1970s. So when it was removed from the provision, now the married woman can also participate in joining, or married women can also join Indian administrative service, then the ratio is enhanced. Now, second challenge in Indian bureaucracy regarding women is like structural changes, which was happened are too late or were too late. Third, even with regarding entry barrier, and women have largely been seen fit only for soft departments. This was a cultural issue. So India still has not have a woman as a RBI governor, cabinet secretary, or chief economic advisor. So this is the mistrust in women's ability. So women have immense potential, but they lack opportunity. Now, what are the women's participation at international level? So organization like IMF, World Bank served as a revolving doors through which talent came to India. But in all these years, this group has largely comprised men, including the position of Indian director to the World Bank. Now, see the current position of women in civil services. Today, the problem of few does not loom as much. Like of 933 candidates selected in the latest round of the UPSC examination, 320 were women. This is the highest ever. And from top 10, in top 10, 6 were women. So these trends are promising as they indicate that more women competent no less as compared to men or other genders. So this is in regard to bureaucracy, but still there is a presence of glass ceiling effect. It can be observed. Now let's move to the climate change, women and gender gap. Climate change, women and gender gap. So climate change, as you know, is one of the greatest global challenges of the 21st century. It impacts vary among regions, generations, age, classes, income, group, and gender. So the impact of climate change on gender is not the same. Women are more vulnerable to climate change as compared to men. Now, why are women more vulnerable? So women vulnerability to climate change stems from number of factors like social, economic, and cultural. Write down first. Women represents the majority of world's poor and are proportionally more dependent on threatened natural resources. This was the first reason. Second, women have less access as compared to men to resources such as land, credit, agricultural inputs, decision-making structures, technology, etc., etc. And it would enhance their capacity to adapt to climate change. So women have less access as compared to men. Third, women have limited access to and control of environmental goods and services because they have negligible participation in decision making and they are not involved in distribution of environmental management benefits. So women are less able to confront climate change. Fourth, in many societies, socio-cultural norms and childcare responsibilities prevent women from migrating and seeking refuges in other places or working when the disaster hits a particular region. So such a situation is likely to put more burden on women. Now just write climate change and domestic violence. Climate change and domestic violence. So climate change will be an added stressor that will aggravate women's vulnerability. It is widely known that during conflict, women face heightened domestic violence, sexual intimidation, human trafficking and rape. Example is a recent example is Manipur. So during extreme weather such as drought and flood, women tends to work more to secure household livelihood. And this will leave less time for women to access education, training, develop a skill, or earn income. So climate crisis and domestic violence are interconnected in several ways. So as climate change can contribute to an increase in domestic violence and exacerbate existing pattern of abuse. Here are some key connections. First, displacement and increased stress. Like displaced population due to natural hazards or disaster often face heightened level of stress, insecurity, and economic hardship. And these factors can create a tense and volatile environment, increasing the risk of domestic violence within household. Second, resource scarcity and competition. So climate change induces resource scarcity, which can escalate household and community tension, creating power imbalances and raising the risk of domestic violence as people compete for essential resources. Third, increased vulnerability and social inequality. Like the existing vulnerabilities can be further exacerbated by the impact of climate change, and it making women more susceptible to domestic violence. So limited access to resources, education, healthcare, legal support can impede women's ability to escape or seek assistance in the abusive situation. Fourth, disruption of support network. So climate change may disrupt support network and community structure. So isolating domestic violence survivors due to relocation and damaged infrastructure. Fifth, mental health impact. So climate change related events can cause emotional distress, anxiety, and trauma, straining relationships, increasing domestic violence. Now, there was a study published in JAMA Psychiatry, JAMA, J-A, JAMA Psychiatry. So the study tracked nearly 1,94,000 girls and women aged between 15 to 49 from India, Pakistan, and Nepal between 2010 to 2018. And they reported experiences of emotional, physical, and sexual violence. And according to that study, the study found a 1 degree increase in average annual temperature was connected to the rise of more than 6.3% in incident of physical and sexual domestic violence across these three South Asian countries. So it compared the data with temperature fluctuation across the same period. So India, which already had a highest reported rate of intimate partner violence, also had a biggest increase in abuse. So with a 1 degree rise in heat came at 8% rise in physical violence and 7.3% rise in sexual violence. This was the study conducted and published by JAMA Psychiatry.